Just to give you a little bit of my perspective, it's been a lot of threat research, a lot of cloud, a lot of identity in the past 5 or 6 years. This topic has sort of been a side interest of mine over the past year. Nothing to do with my day job, but really comes from a couple sources. And before I get into that, I just want to poke a little bit of fun at how we use buzzwords to sort of talk about security topics, right? So whether it's canary tokens or tripwires or barbed wires or landmines, this is sort of the state we're in. It is important for us to be clear on terminology, so I do want to be clear about what kind of deceptive defenses I'm going to be talking about, and depending on your approach, same on your side as we go into it. But my perspective has been really why come to this topic in the first place, right? Before we talk about defenses, we have to sort of set the scene with attacks and threats, because if there are none, then we can go to the beach and retire, right? So we'll cover a bit of what do we mean, what do I mean. Part of that, not to bury the lead, is I think it's been about 10 to 20 years of cloud and SaaS, depending on how you define that. So it's about time we sort of revisit whether we've been sleeping at the wheel. It's different than old school on-prem networks, TCP/IP, where we worried about a lot of layers that aren't so exposed in cloud and SaaS, right? So we'll go through examples. I want to bring in a bit of a design approach, just ground up. Let's just take a fresh look and see if we're exploring all the ideas that should. And then, of course, if you're trying to implement any kind of deceptive defenses, there's a lot of real-world issues. It's great to talk about ideas, but hopefully we can get into some of the details of implementation, right? So hopefully there's at least 2 goals to achieve by the end of this talk. One is I really do want to stretch your thinking, sort of not just outside of the box. It's probably like a multi-dimensional cube, right? Let's really think a little bit larger, because I think to move the security needle, we have to think more than one step ahead, right? If we're just reacting to the breach of the day, the IOC of the day, it's probably going to happen again. At the same time, just staying in ideas isn't really useful. So second goal, can we give you a takeaway of something that might help you wherever you are with deceptive defenses? So my perspective has been shaped a bit by I hate losing. I hate having a bump on my forehead from banging against the wall. So, there's 2 probably anecdotal sources depending on what your day job is, but if you're a blue hat, you probably share day-to-day is frustrating trying to defend and protect your environment. If you read the news, well, we don't have to look far, so I'll cherry pick a few relevant examples in my mind of why we need to think about defenses maybe in a new way. So we'll start with sort of Microsoft, just recent, pretty high impact. So if we roll back a year to Blizzard, the point here, without going into the finer details, is just the attackers are getting smarter. They're using stealthier techniques. They're winning because this is Microsoft that's been breached, and of course, we'd expect the big vendors to be good. They're not short of money and resources. They build much of this. So yeah, alarm bells start ringing from a blue hat perspective. And if you read the details, you start seeing OAuth abuse, but you see persistence, right? You're seeing parts of the attack chain that are beyond privilege escalation and initial access. That should worry us, because it's the attackers getting more sophisticated. Staying on the Microsoft front, we can roll forward, or well, actually July 23, it's a little bit backwards, but for Storm, different threat actors, probably nation state, China in this case. What's the key here? Well, we got different tokens. They're not OAuth tokens. We had MSA tokens. It sort of smelled like business email compromise, but when you dig into the details, and this is a breakdown from a different source, you see a long chain of attacks. And then Microsoft was good enough to do some analysis in their blogs, if you read through this. I do want to give a nod to Microsoft that they shared a lot of their analysis. And you could see them zig and zag. Like, was the MSA token forged? Was it, on the consumer side? Was it the, exchange on the business side? There was confusion you could see in their blogs. But we benefit as a community because now we're like, wow, there was a chained attack of like 10 steps, and they had breakdowns in processes, and lateral movement and all sorts of things. And the point here is attackers are winning with different attack points and vectors. And the last example, not to beat the dead horse, but sort of headlines, is more recent. 2 months ago, different storm attack, back to Russia. Pretty sophisticated. Front end, we're doing OAuth phishing, but we're really injecting into the device registration flow of Windows when you join a device to the domain. And the objective for access is the PRT token, which is the Uber token if you're not deep into Microsoft. With that, you can mint and create refresh tokens and access tokens and do your API calls. And you can launch browser sessions. Plus, you have that trust that goes along with devices joined to the domain. You can do SSO, right? You can do everything. That's why it's key and has been fairly hard to hijack or steal because you had to be on the endpoint, but now there's a way to use OAuth up front and receive remotely some of the tokens and start the flow. And there's a lot of detail in the links. You should go read it if you haven't and you're an Azure customer. But the point is more not to hinge on that. It's, boy, now we're going into ever more sophisticated attacks. So what's coming next? We don't know. That's the problem. It's the unknown is by definition, right? What's underneath the water? Is it 90% of what we see, or is it 99.99% that's coming, right? But we do know some things. We don't have to be blind and just sit back. If we look at some of the published research, what I highlighted in yellow is, it's a shame, but in this case, with the storm of 2 months ago, 2372, that research had been done by the community. The device code phishing has been known for over 4 years. The PRT and the device registration piece on the back end has been known for over a year. Yet here we are in Microsoft's advisory. They weren't breached. They were just advising everyone that Russian threat actors they're seeing activity and Microsoft customers are breached. So this is a terrible state. This is what gives me the big bump on the forehead. It makes me tired of losing. Can't we do better, right? That's the point. Even if the attackers are smart and evolving. So I think it starts with what's probably become a cliche, but it's more acting on every layer will be breached. It's not just saying that conveniently so you can come by my expo exhibit and buy something. It's how does that change your mentality once you assume every protective measure is breached? Yes, you will still try to protect things and lock the doors, but you're just going to assume some malicious actor, maybe even an insider, is already past that point. And whatever we do, just being tired of doing the same thing, I think is reason enough to spend an hour revisiting defenses, and particularly something like deception. So that's where we're going to go, is my angle is stealth. All right, some people mean different things by deception. And I do want to take a nod that MITRE has done some thinking here. They have the attack framework, which is more the attack side, which most of us are familiar with. I think as a taxonomy and classification, it's useful. As a implementation point, it's not enough detail when I'm thinking about defenses, but they also have Engage, which talks very clearly about deception. So if you're involved in this as a blue hat kind of an organization, you can sort of map my talk into here, and I want to sort of map it, except the one thing where I diverge is I'm thinking about stealth. A lot of the words that are used in the MITRE Engage is sort of active engagement, waste the time of the adversary. I want to be quiet. I want to be quiet because I want to use it for detection, and I want to be silent, and I want to have really the attacker be tripped up without knowing it. And going on, there's lures and within the detect. And of course, they do have defend. They're sort of covering all the pieces, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the MITRE framework, not a knock on it, but it grew out of old school stuff. So if you actually look at the categories, there are a lot of sort of on-prem, full OS stacks kind of techniques, both attacking and defending. I'm thinking about cloud. We don't have enough. Even though there's a cloud matrix on attack, we just don't have enough detail. And even with MITRE Defend, MITRE says they have a lot of ROI on their approach, but there's no details. And you can sort of understand, you don't want to show your secrets of deceptive defenses, but how can we act on that? We can't. We have no shared details. So I think we have to be sharing more, and that's part of this talk. So let me start with a story. This is old school story, mine as well. And this is real enough, actually, from 20-some years ago when I was in vulnerability management. Great CTO I worked for. It's a Unix story. Before Linus ate the world, there used to be Unix and even different flavors. It used to be Spark. The story is, how do you detect and defend your most inner ring zero kind of inner sanctum server? You can put up all these protections, old school networking, so on. But let's assume that you're worried someone reaches it, finally. Maybe they get root shell, maybe they're physically there, who knows? What do you do as a defender? And so the story goes, well, here's one thing we could do. We basically remap or replace something like LS, and we make it do a shutdown immediately. And this is just a little shell code, just because it's concise. Please don't pick it apart and say how someone can escape it. The point is more, hey, you could do that because pretty much the target for most attackers will be to get shell. Even if you're doing a buffer overflow, et cetera, you want to be productive, get to a shell, and make use of the OS tools. And what's one of the first things you probably are going to do? You're going to navigate LS, CD, and boom, right? You'll be tripped up, and in this case, the remediation action happens immediately, shuts down the server. And from a Blue Hat perspective, you could monitor whether the server's up or not. You've maybe saved things, and you also know that you have been breached to your most innermost sanctum. So that kind of story leads to, okay, how can we think about that conceptually and then start moving back to the cloud? Well, I'll put forth sort of 4 metaphors that, yes, have been overused, and I'll try just to define them. I think we think about choke points. What are common traversal points that the attacker must go through or has a super high probability of going through in the cloud? And I think it's achievable because the cloud's just a bunch of APIs for the most part. If you remove compute instances, we're back to just a bunch of APIs. And so you're looking for, what are they going to traverse? 2, what will they do that is sort of an indicator, a tripwire, that this is suspicious versus a valid kind of user action? And in the old school story, that was LS. Then there's the response, or detection and responses, a landmine, a grenade, right? And in this case, it was shut down in the old school. And there's a 4th factor that we have to keep in mind, because it's all good to say this, but if you got FPs, you're killing the good guys. If admins can't actually do work and they go through the same point, well, it's not going to fly. We all know that. No one's going to use it, and someone's going to yell at you and fire you because, you know, someone can't do things. So in the old school story, the last part of it is, well, if you can't do LS, can you actually still admin that server? Well, yeah, you know, little geeky joke, you could do echo star, and you get a poor man's version of listing files, okay? Great, so now we have the genesis of sort of thinking about stealthy defenses. Let's move it back to cloud and maybe a simplified attack chain. So I've just drawn it a little bit differently, where the nodes are sort of certain states, and the edges are sort of what we consider these categories or tactics of sort of the attack chain. And it's not as complicated as MITRE, because I don't want to go too granular at this stage, right? So what's interesting about thinking about this? I already said I think we have a chance, because now we're just at some layer, 6 or 7 of APIs, for the most part, if you ignore compute instances. And I think we can identify choke points and tripwires. So one thing I want to look at is discovery. Discovery in the sense of where it's used all throughout the attack chain, right? Not just for recon when there's no sort of authenticated access. I want to look at what the attacker might do when they're trying to achieve persistence or laterally move, which is a little bit different in cloud, right? You're not laterally moving across IP addresses. Usually it's resources and maybe some identities. Privilege escalation for sure, and certainly when it gets to data exfil or other actions. I want to look at discovery because it's different in the cloud attack chain. Of course, we'll look at access. Two major categories: identities of various kinds, depending on what cloud provider, and resources, which is usually more on access, buckets, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what we're going to go through is examples in these areas. This is a lot. Let me touch on sort of how I'm thinking about it, and then you can map it and think about whether that makes sense as we go through examples. I want to look at ignored, underserved parts of the attack chain. I think we as a community are hyper-focused on initial access and privilege escalation for good reason. Because you get access, you privilege escalate, and then you can do actions, right? But let's not forget this discovery piece, which is part of a lot of cloud activity. Let's not forget persistence, which if you roll back to my headline news, legacy OAuth in Blizzard was used to privilege escalate. Someone came back into the environment, found something, and was both a backdoor and privilege escalation in my mind. Identity access, resource access, of course. But then there's sort of these dimensions that cross our analysis or thinking. We have to be thinking about where do we put tripwires, location. What do I mean by that? You have to actually understand and rethink your perimeter. We'll get to examples there, but what do I mean by that? Okay, EC2 instances or virtual machines. The obvious one, it's within your IAM cloud perimeter. But do you have cloud shells that are interactive? They're just running on the same instances. Are those the same kind of points? That's a different piece. What about your endpoints? Workers, laptops, admins working from home. It's outside your cloud IAM perimeter. It's definitely inside your corporate perimeter. You manage those endpoints. You worry about that. You have control. You have policies. You have EDR. You have whatever, right? So I think we have to be really, really careful about not just drawing a solid line around cloud IAM and say, oh, yeah, don't worry about it, because we're trying to find the attacker stealthily, and we have to think about that. Timing, I mean in terms of there's access and use and those kinds of issues, and we should really think about that, because I could think about an EC2 or a compute instance as accessing it of just connecting maybe to it. And I can also think about maybe it's worth letting the attacker interact with it like a honeypot and go further. I could apply that to a resource. Just enumerating a resource may not be enough to detect suspicious activity, but maybe there's a deep embedded file that I look for, okay? Decoy type. Okay, let me throw a few kind of metaphors at you, but I think they're useful. Not all decoys of sorts are equal. So the purloined one is to sort of in plain sight. So let's just, when we get to resources that we might create that are fake, let's say we're talking about user accounts. One way to think about that is, oh, out of my 10,000 users, I create another one that just looks like another Joe user, okay? But a different one would be to add a little bit of honey, if you allow me to reuse some of these words, and say, actually it's named Joe Admin, right? Because I'm trying to think about an attacker enumerating and thinking about which of these, if they're selective or prioritized, they might want to go after. Versus privileged are sort of the built-in privileged ones. In the cloud environments, there tend to be not so much user accounts, but roles and such that are built-in administrator, global admin, right? Those, can we do something with those? And what could we do? Well, sometimes the cloud providers allow us, I call it neutering or eunuch, okay, just so I can remember it. It's, you can take something and with some other policy lock it down. And we know this, it's a great feature. Something like a service control policy in AWS can lock down root in a single member account, right? VPC boundary in GCP can do things and restrict things. Why would that be useful? Because I can keep the original privileged role and maybe entice the user, an attacker, to use it, but it's really neutered. It actually doesn't do things, right? These are the nuances, I think, when we get to talking about decoy types. Defense rotation is the usual thing. If we build anything and it's a value, boy, we're part of the footprint. We're going to have to rotate whatever is fake and decoys. It can't be static. Insider threats at a minimum, but a good attacker will start to see patterns if they're in your environment. And last but not least, coming back to, we got to worry about false positives, or else none of this matters, right? Okay, so let's take some examples. Discovery side. We'll start with AWS. I have some Azure examples. Most of them should apply to Google as well. Those were sort of my framework for sort of cloud IaaS, cloud service providers. So there's typically a path, API call-wise, to fully enumerate things like permissions and policies. And I would put forth that's a very common thing that is done by an attacker post-initial access, because that's how they know what resources and what permissions they can use to maybe move laterally and then get data, do damage, privilege escalate. A lot of tools obviously automate this. So straight up, without deception, of course we could look at this sequence and try to detect, whoa, we're being enumerated, right? That's great. We keep that. I'm not saying don't do that. Just play out what the attacker might do. They end up, at least in the AWS world, with sort of the equivalent of policy role, and they might say, wow, my user or whatever I compromise, whatever credential, can assume role, which is, right, one of the key things in AWS for privilege escalation, right? That's definitely a big thing. They might do some additional AWS-specific things to make sure they can actually be, trusted and assume that role, impersonate and get that. So from a deceptive part, this is the analysis where we can think about, can we use the policy itself, that is the viewing of the policy details, as a choke point? That it's very probable for an attacker to do that. I think so. How about the FP side? Let's do a little sniff test. Yeah, some admins might do it, but I would venture it's the opposite kind of complementary percentage, right? You don't check your permissions usually until you get blocked, right? At least we hope that's the high majority of case. So that's the theory when we start coming up with what's a good choke point. Now what's the actual trip wires is when the attacker sees a specific, whoa, there's an API that's admin level or wildcarded with a star or assume role. That's just speaks privilege escalation, right? Or maybe it's the resource, a finance bucket, right? Or a very specific permission, like I can roll back or change the version of some code or policy, in this case, permissions, because I want to look and see if an older version has admin privileges, right? And I go change it and maybe assign it and so on. So these become the trips where an attacker might actually access and use them, right? Some of this maps right over to all the cloud providers because everyone has some means to escalate roles. So it's not quite assume role, but Azure definitely has, right, a good defensive practice, which is sort of this just-in-time assume higher admin privileges, right? And it has to be granted by an admin, and there's a API call to do that if you've been, granted that privilege. So we could assume or think about there's a parallel in Azure where the choke point is still this enumeration of permissions, just different API calls, and the trips would be, attackers see something really juicy, which could be a built-in admin role like Cloud App Administrator will definitely, attract things because it's pretty high up there. You can control service principals, right? Set them as, authenticate as them. And it could be custom roles or other things that have been created deceptively, right? And to finish the thought is, of course, it's, you have to move to detecting this, right? So I didn't play that out with the AWS example, but what would it mean with Azure? Again, a parallel is if they actually do something with that role, like try to activate it, that would be the Azure terminology, we're looking for that in the event logs. Someone tried to activate this role that we purposely set up as just something that we thought they would do. It could be a custom role that has no permissions. It might be, if we could achieve it, a neutered cloud app admin role for a certain resource group. The point is more, would an attacker be incented to do this as part of their normal discovery? I think so. Normally, you don't leave stuff on the table. You enumerate everything because, man, everyone's behind. No one's going to react. By the time the SOC goes through 1,000 alerts, you're gone, right? So I think so, at least today. Let's keep moving on discovery. Of course, we could have a straightforward different kind of discovery detection, which is, you don't have to look at the activation of roles, which is sort of this assuming privilege. You just look at, hey, I got initial access as an attacker. What are my direct sort of role assignments? Again, we could do without deception and just look at, boy, enumeration of all that is suspicious, right? But we could also be deceptive about it and put in a unique decoy type, which is a custom role put in there, assigned to one or a bunch or all users, and count on an attacker wanting to check it out. And maybe they're using a tool, so it's not even a decision point, right? Attacker probably automates a lot. You're not going to hand look at things, right? Okay, so let's take a pause and also talk about tools while we're talking about discovery and enumeration. This will lead to maybe other thoughts on choke points and tripwires. And I think we have to get really specific. It's not like we haven't been aware of detecting exploit tools, right? That's already in our mindset, right? From C2 exploit frameworks. In the cloud, though, it's there, but maybe we can use it a little bit differently. Of course, we can look at tool activity, all right? But let's take Pacu in the AWS world as an example, and there's also a bunch of research. Sometimes these things don't even get logged. So when we bend AWS in this cross-account role trust, and Pacu, I think Rhino Labs was one of the first to exploit the reverse trust process. It's not that I'm poking to see if you have a role. I create a role and I trust back, and I get a different response, and therefore I'm able to enumerate, and nothing appears in CloudTrail, so it doesn't matter. Okay, I can't detect it. Head on, I can't detect that piece of enumeration. It's also, unauthenticated too, right? I'm focused on post-auth, but there's a value there. I got to think of this because they have a dictionary list that's built in. So this gives me, if I'm going to create fake roles, well, maybe I pick, administrator sounds good, and these esoteric ones, I have no idea where Rhino Labs came up with it, but it's based on something. Let me sprinkle those back in my own policies. Because someone could actually run this after they have access too, right? I mean, and it doesn't matter. The point is, I want to know what some of the targets are in discovery, whether it's through tools or just through, hey, what's obvious? And I want to make those tripwires, right? Because how can you know if that's a fake or neutered or whatever role until you do something with it? That's my point in trying to think about this. All right, let's move to some standard things. Where else can we put tripwires and think about choke points? So accessing identities, whether accounts, roles, permissions, for sure. This is normally what we've labeled as canary or honey tokens in sort of the startup world, the expo world, wherever you encounter this, right? But I do want to go back to organization, Netflix, which does do some really good security and shares it. And this is a couple years old. Actually, this one's a little bit more recent, but it's still out there and has been out there, right? So they did good analysis on the quirks of creating fake accounts versus fake roles, which are identities in AWS, very specific to cloud provider. There'd be a different answer here for Azure. We'd have to look at service principles and other things, okay? But they decided they could use an EC2 instance and manufacture a whole bunch of temporary role session tokens and then go plant them out there. Out there being where? They put the cache credentials of where an AWS CLI gets installed. That could be the EC2 instance. Could be a Cloud Shell, technically. Could be an endpoint because an admin uses that CLI. That's good thinking, right? In my mind, that's good thinking, because then someone uses that token, and the way they manufacture it, it's either neutered, whatever, they're looking for that use. So no downside, but they get to see if someone is penetrating wherever they placed it. And what do you do as an attacker? Just like you check .ssh on a particular thing, you check .config.aws in the cloud, right? That's just a given. Second thing they've done is a different thing with identity access. I love this idea. It's a pattern we should look for elsewhere deceptively. It's playing man in the middle for their own defense. So all of the cloud providers have this metadata service, usually for compute instances. You get on that box, how do you get credentials of whatever the compute instance is running as? You got this nice little service that runs locally, and you just do a curl, a get, and boom, you got these nice tokens that are the identity of the compute instance, so you can run your scripts, right, and authenticate into the cloud environment. So the normal flow on AWS is roughly like this. You hit that metadata service, it does stuff on the back end, grabs your token, and whatever requested it, away you go. And they created this proxy to change the flow. So they created a custom app, they reworked IP tables so that if you're querying the IP address, the local of the metadata service, you actually have to go through their proxy. They get control, they're man in the middle. They know the IP address of the EC2 instance. They grab a temporary token just like it would be by the real metadata service. And then they make use of an AWS feature, which if you're in there, you're probably familiar with adminning it, is when you assume role and escalate privileges, you optionally, as the caller, can put in a constraining policy. So they did it to constrain the IP address to the EC2 instance, meaning the requester could only use that, it would only work on that host. So what does this prevent in their minds? The whole bunch of offboarding, I've been penetrated on the EC2 instance, they grab the token, but the old school way is you usually exfil that to, somewhere in IPv4 land, and on a different host, start using that token. This would block it, because there's that policy governing that token. Pretty clever, right? It's a protection thinking, not a detection. They detect it, of course, but it's a little bit different than how I would do it. But it's an awesome idea because, in fact, they've neutered or controlled the permissions with this token. And it's hard. It'd be really hard for an attacker to know that, because the first thing you don't do is, do you have access to the IP tables? Do you even know? No, the first thing you do is you go straight to the metadata service and grab that token, and you're going, right? That's not in your mindset. So that's something we can use later for deceptive defenses as well. Location was one of the dimensions. I mentioned this, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but for whatever reason, all the CLIs of the cloud providers store things in clear text cached locally. For whatever reason, they haven't heard of the secure vaults and integrated with them. But so detriment, if the endpoint's breached, those directories, top right, as well as it's Google that in the picture, get checked. Okay, we know that's a point of vulnerability. Let's put some fake credentials that actually work, but we're monitoring them. They go to accounts that have nothing in them, whatever. They don't even have to go to real accounts. A failure, just knowing that credential we look for. So the location of these is paramount. This could be endpoints, could be Cloud Shells, it could be EC2 instances, hit everywhere where there's cached or CLIs installed. Let's talk about access versus use briefly. You could imagine you have a virtual machine, and yes, you can direct SSH to it, but the best practices of all the vendors are, no, we have a way for you to not expose 22 to the internet. You come in as your IAM user, and we work this magic and dynamically handle keys, but you get in there, and it's all logged. Not every customer is close to using it, but we could think about that, because a good attacker might see this in a policy, say, oh, here's an EC2 instance, and I know the API call, and I have permission. It's this start session thing. I'm going to try it. So how could we handle this deceptively? We should cover this path. might be the tripwire for that attacker. And what would we do? We don't actually have to spend the money to keep an EC2 instance running. We all know that break the bank. AWS does make money off idle EC2 instances, right? Just the error of not being able to connect would be knowing that someone saw this and connected to it. And then you just have to ask yourself, would normal admins forget and say, oh no, I'm supposed to do something with this and try to connect? Would there be false positives? But the thought is cover different API tracks, right? Okay, let's talk about the FP problem. We'll use resources, okay. Enumeration of buckets would be really noisy. Even if you have fake buckets that are enticingly named, people do forget bucket names. That's a noisy area to have a quick trigger. But my analogy is maybe we think about access in multiple levels. So the real world analogy is the movies with shady characters like mafia and whatnot. You go into the restaurant they own or the casino, and they're in the back room where all the legal stuff is happening, but there's a hallway, right? And the characters in the movie are always trying to go down the hallway and get in. So instead of locking the door to the hallway, you leave it open, and there's a sign that just says, employees only. So people can go through that. And it's partly because you're not sure. You don't want to be too noisy because people get lost looking for the bathroom, which is always the movie line. So you have a second sign which says, bathrooms behind you, absolutely off limits, but there's no door. They blow by that and turn a corner, and then you have a bodyguard who's sleeping. Gives you confidence if maybe 3 stops are blown by that you're allowing, by the time they get to walking by the bodyguard, now you have a higher true positive. So buckets is a little bit hard because it's really just this big blob storage with paths. There's not really this hierarchy like file systems, yet most of the apps treat it like file systems. So we might think about enumeration, because you think about attackers, sometimes they don't want to try to suck up a terabyte all at once. That'd be noisy. They might want to interactively look once they've got access to a bucket. And would they go top level and go down a certain path? That's the thinking I think we need to do with resource access, so we're not too noisy on the FP side. There's another way to think about FPs as well, though. All of this is leaning towards, yes, it'd be great if we could convert the gray to black, the spectrum of risk, the gray that we aren't sure about. But sometimes it's also thinking about converting the gray to white. So our 99% of unsure becomes just a smaller slice. So we look at certain things like, AWS supports things like tagging when you do something like assume role. And if you know AWS, when you have external access, that's often part of a little bit of the trust in proving things as some secret tag that you have to use, right? The external ID. So we can take that feature and maybe identify valid users, right? A valid user should put in a tag that identifies them. It could be a crypto signature. It could be simpler. It would probably have to be automated as part of tools and workflow, so people aren't forgetting. But it's an idea worth considering, because now suddenly we identify, 99% of the time this person put the right thing in it, so our detections don't fire noise at the SOC. And guess what? We can probably find tagging everywhere. We might have to be very specific about the cloud providers, but in Azure, their equivalent to assume role was sort of this role activation, this just-in-time piece. Guess what? They put in a reason field so you can explain, right, for audit purposes, why you're elevating to global admin or whatnot. Great. Well, that becomes tagged and logged. So we could put in there something in the valid user workflow that gives us high confidence, it's a ticket number, it's a whatever, it's a signature, and have our detections not fire, it's a good guy, let's go back to bad guy actions. And so all of that sort of boils down into these checkpoints and tripwire ideas that I've been noodling on, right? Look at discovery, resource, and identity access. Be very aware of the location that you place these, because they can help. The tripwire themselves are within sort of those choke point areas. Think about resource tripwires, but those subtypes, are they like really obvious purloined letter kind of things? Are they just little honey because they're named admin? Are they the default admin, which no one's ever going to ignore, but you're feeling good because you have a way to neuter them? So even if they try to use it, sorry, root doesn't do anything. It actually shows as an error in AWS if you lock it down with that service control policy. So we're very close because a lot of these providers have copied each other in design patterns. It's the way it goes, right? They're like, oh, what did this vendor do? Oh, okay, we'll improve on it, but we're going to borrow the pattern. So let's use that to our advantage because the attackers are using that to their advantage. They're like, oh, AWS does this. Microsoft did that too. Why did we get IMDS SSRF attacks in mass? Because everyone was dumb and said, oh, SSRF, all that web stuff, when we did cloud, we just forgot about it until the attackers went cloud by cloud. And then everyone put in anti-SSRF around that metadata service, right? That's what's happened in the last 5 years. So let's use those patterns to our advantage in deception, not just leave it to the attackers to recognize this. Think about, man in the middle. Sometimes there's these very specific APIs or features. Again, attackers are looking at bypassing that. Oh, there's this quirk in Microsoft and Azure. Well, sometimes those quirks can be used for deceptive purposes. Let's use them. And then, yeah, we have to think about the appropriate action, right? Not everything's a landmine. You kill the attacker, revoke access. Sometimes you might just increase logging to collect more information or have, human resource join the observation, right? All of these may be needed to make this viable. Okay, let me talk a little bit about some real-world stuff. I'm sort of summarizing that the kind of approach I'm putting forth as ideas is think about the design of the environment you're actually worried about, the cloud service provider. Can't be caught at the MITRE level. Again, not a knock on MITRE. It's, if you're going to do something, it's how does AWS work? Oh, what's different about Azure? Oh, Google Cloud. And if we ever get to SaaS, it's, oh, Okta has an impersonate feature. That sounds like assume role, right? It's that level of detail. Think about the attack chain, enumeration, access, discovery, especially persistence and other things that we don't normally think about first. And of course, the common attack vectors will always be there, so you might as well prioritize those higher. Compute instances will always be attacked. Anything publicly facing will always be attacked. Those help us rethink the perimeter, which is usually not the strict IAM boundary. So just endpoints is an easy one, but then there's also inside these other things hidden as compute instances. Cloud shells, I'm gonna just say that again, is waiting to be exploited. Probably what saves it is there aren't good APIs because it's an interactive feature. So you have to compromise the browser to get to the Cloud Shell. But if you compromise an admin who uses Cloud Shell, their CLI will still be installed, there'll be cached credentials, and that's a beautiful place to put your backdoor as well as find further access. If that's true, we should think about, can we somehow inject some deceptive trips there, like fake tokens in that cache directory? If so, at least we'll have some coverage, right? Because what we think is hard today with no APIs, someone's already solved that, right? They're like, we know how to compromise browser cookies and sessions, don't worry about that. We can bypass MFA this way, don't worry about it. I can script and get to that cloud session once I've got that, right? It's assuming you're gonna be breached. Just because we can't envision the attack path doesn't mean it's not gonna happen. And if we can do this at a low enough cost, why not? And that is the next sort of question. Just last piece, integrating across the silos, here's what I think is the irony and causes the bump on the forehead for me. Defense in depth is good, but we tend to implement it as silos at the human level. So they don't talk to each other. The IAM admin provisioning team doesn't really talk to the SOC, except, sometimes things are escalated, but you don't really talk security. Like, dude, if you did this when you provisioned, it'd be a lot easier to detect suspicious things later. And then if you detect suspicious things, it's like, hey, did you know maybe you could turn on MFA, right? You know, that talk doesn't happen enough. So some of this is layer 8 stuff, but some of it comes back to, if we think about it, we'll think about deception a little bit differently. Like, enumeration's noisy, but it might help us later as a low indicator. We're not going to fire an alert, but we're going to track it, right? And all this leads to better signal fidelity, right? So at some point, we have to take the complement of this talk, which is not gray to black, it's gray to white. We have to think about that for the false positive issue. And so we're approaching the end. More considerations. Let's just put it out there. If you're blue hat building, ignore this, could be a viable thing. I got too much, this is important, doesn't move the needle, not gonna argue. You know your organization. If you're gonna act, you're gonna think about, can I buy? Is there stuff out there that's worth it? And then there isn't, or it's worth it to build because I have a huge organization, I got the resources, and it's high on the list of priorities. No way around it. It's a problem, and I can't answer it. It's you guys who are doing the work. But the finer details are about the cost. So even if we had a way to create these tripwires, it has to be at a low enough cost from an admin perspective. And the natural place this fits is during admin workflows. Because if you're going to provision user accounts, you might as well create fake user accounts without even thinking about it. Could you do it on a build your own? Of course. If you're doing scripting, CLI commands, and you're not driven by browser kind of interactive stuff, you could probably find a way to create some and fit it in. This could be just handled separately out of band. Some tools you run every week to do things, hoping you don't get confused when you come in through your normal admin processes and you don't clobber something. It's possible. It's not easy. I'm not saying that's a great long-term solution. Some of this does point back to vendors who are in this space. You would ideally want them to take care of things. Like, in my mind, could there be a time in the future where it's deception by default? You just don't even know. You're just doing your business, focusing on your business, but underneath, they both provision deceptive defenses, monitor for them, and those are the alerts, part of the alerts you get. And you don't accidentally clobber it. It automatically gets rotated. Now, if there's startups out there, they might think about that, but they don't control, the admin. The big platform vendors, I'll be honest, I think you get dumb when you're big. You think acquiring a bunch of companies and maybe putting their output into a log or a SIM makes them integrated, and then they sell it to customers. Yeah, I'm not saying that's easy, but the cost is something that has to be thought about. The other thing that needs to be thought about is, if we introduce any of this stuff, anytime you build stuff, we've learned that lesson, it's got problems with it. Are we adding to the problems, the attack surface for the attacker? Are we just creating more problems that we're gonna have to troubleshoot? Possibly, for sure. Or you just make mistakes, or an insider knows all the secrets. The savings grace for this topic is you're starting from your current state. So if you're worried about detecting things, and people know what you've put in deceptively, what's the outcome? They probably bypass it. It's not like they go, you're not introducing new vulnerabilities. If you think about neutered roles and careful things, you have to think about that. I'm not saying there can't be mistakes. In the end, though, there are two important things going forward: coverage and efficacy in testing. How do you even know the endpoint? Like, even if you thought this was a great idea and you said, oh, I can do those two things, I know how to do it, and it's perfect cost. I hate checkpoint, checklist security, because we'll be here next year. There'll be a different speaker. They'll be like, oh, hey, I know about deceptive defenses. It's just you forgot these three things. And you'll be like, oh, God, goodness gracious, right? Where's the end of this? Part of it is we need to go back to some analysis. We need to bring frameworks for attack chains, because this is based on attacks and TTP. Bring it down to level and just say, look, here's the universe. We're still at sub-technique level per cloud provider, and there's 62 subcategories, and at least we have some coverage, and we understand that. Last thing, forward thinking about testing and efficacy. It's hard to measure anything security, especially detection, because you don't want to be breached. If you're doing pen testing, red teaming, work this into that plan. We can do it. Make the scope about persistence and evasion. You pay people, they'll do it. Red team, you control everything. Bug bounty, you can still direct it. If you can stay hidden for 7 days, you get money. That, right? Beacon out. Do it in our cloud. Here's authenticated access. Go for it. We'll remove it after day 1, the authenticated access. Go for it. And we'll have our real defenses blue teaming looking at it, but they'll be blind. Some nuances there. It's not just putting that out there. You would have to probably simulate real activity. Can't make it too easy for the blue team, because any activity is like, oh yeah, someone's doing something suspicious. Take your logs, reshape them, pump them in. Not easy, but this whole problem isn't easy, right? So thank you. Takeaways, think about it. Think about whether any of it applies to you. And if it doesn't, that's awesome. I'm sharing. I want to hear. Reach out to me. Tell me why things don't make sense, because this is what I noodle on when I'm taking a shower. Thank you.